Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden among the wind-swept hills and ancient oaks of Exmoor? Let me take you there, to a wild corner of Devon where legends are born and sometimes, just sometimes, the truth is stranger than fiction. Picture it, early morning, drones soaring over rolling moorland, mist curling through the valleys, violin music swirling in the air. The real England, not the one you see in tourist brochures. This is where our story begins, with a young noblewoman named Lady Victoria Beaumont. Victoria was no ordinary aristocrat. Despite the centuries-old lineage, the stately family crest, and the grand ancestral home looming over the village like a silent guardian, she craved more than idle tea parties and polite society. She belonged to the land, boots muddy from the fields, hair tousled by the wind, face flushed with that unmistakable Exmoor spirit. Every day, rain or shine, she saddled up her beloved Willow, a sturdy English mare with a mane as soft as dandelion fluff, and rode out to patrol the wild spaces she had sworn to protect. Not out of duty, but out of love, for the National Trust and for Exmoor itself. On that fateful morning, Victoria rode with the kind of joy that belongs only to those who know every path, every whisper of grass beneath their horses' hooves. The air tasted of heather and distant salt from the sea. She paused on the ridge, Willow snorting contentedly, and looked down across the ancient woodland. The world felt both impossibly big and intimately hers, a patchwork of history, nature, and possibility. You could almost believe it would last forever. But forever is an illusion. Trouble, as it always does, found its way to Exmoor in a tailored suit and polished brogues. Lord Reginald Hargrove, once a mere rumor whispered at village meetings, had become a storm on the horizon. Hargrove was the kind of man who smiled as he signed away green fields for profit, a man who believed power was his birthright and the land itself existed to serve his ambitions. To him, Exmoor was not a sanctuary, but a commodity, one he meant to transform into a playground for the rich, sweeping away generations of tradition and wilderness with the stroke of a pen. Victoria had spent weeks fighting him in council meetings and quiet pub corners, rallying farmers, bird-watchers, and old-timers who knew every stone wall by heart. But on this day, the battle would leave the meeting rooms behind and spill out into the open moor. The sun was dipping low, throwing gold across the bracken, when Victoria turned Willow toward the old oaks, a shortcut home. She should have noticed the quiet, too quiet for Exmoor, where even the silence has a heartbeat. She should have seen the shadows waiting between the trees. Suddenly, men emerged, their faces half hidden by flat caps, their eyes cold. Victoria barely had time to react before strong arms pulled her from the saddle. Willow reared, whinnying in panic, but a rope snapped tight around Victoria's wrists, rough bark scraping her skin as she was hauled to an ancient oak and tied fast. She struggled, kicking out, but they only laughed. "Well, Lady Beaumont, always knew you were a troublemaker," one of them sneered, voice thick with local accent and malice. Victoria glared at him. "This is my land as much as yours, more. You're nothing but thugs doing Hargrove's dirty work." A backhanded slap silenced her. Willow's cries faded as someone led the horse away, hooves echoing into the gathering dusk. One of the men yanked Victoria's phone from her coat, smashing it against a rock with a triumphant flourish. "You should have stayed out of our business," he hissed. "People like you think you can stop progress? Lord Hargrove's got bigger plans than you can imagine. Enjoy your night out here. Hope you like the cold." And just like that, they vanished, boots trampling the grass, leaving Victoria alone, trussed like a criminal beneath the ancient tree. The wind picked up, cold and merciless, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. For a moment, everything was still, too still. Anger roared inside her, hot and helpless. This was England in the 21st century. How could such things happen, even now, when the world was supposed to have moved past such cruelty? She twisted against the ropes, nails digging into the bark, but it was useless. The cords bit into her wrists. She shouted until her throat was raw, but the moor swallowed her voice. No one answered. No one came. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. Her coat was little protection against the biting wind, and every muscle ached from the struggle. Rain began, a soft patter at first, then harder, icy and unrelenting. Victoria's teeth chattered, her breath fogged in the gloom. In the distance, a fox barked, or was it something larger? Her heart thud, but she refused to cry.
Can you imagine it? Lady Victoria Beaumont, heir to centuries of tradition, reduced to prey in her own land, cast aside like a problem to be erased. And for what? So a greedy man could pave paradise and sell it to strangers with fat wallets. The injustice burned brighter than the cold, a fury that would not be quenched, not by rain, not by fear. As the first true shivers of night set in, Victoria's mind raced. How long before someone noticed her missing? Would anyone come searching? Or had Hargrove's influence bought their silence too? For the first time, a whisper of doubt crept in. She was strong, yes, but was she strong enough? You'll have to wait and see how the night unfolds. For now, the moor held its secrets. And Lady Victoria, fierce, defiant, utterly alone, was left to face the darkness with nothing but her wits, her courage, and the distant hope that somewhere justice was still possible. The cold crept in like an unwanted memory, gnawing at Lady Victoria Beaumont's bones as the night pressed closer. Her fingers, numb from the tight ropes and the rain, tried to twist free, but every movement sent a new jolt of pain up her arms. Time became slippery, marked only by the relentless rhythm of water dripping from the branches overhead and the distant roar of wind through the heather. No matter how she shifted, the rough bark dug deeper into her back, the indignity as sharp as the cold. But Victoria's mind refused to surrender. Instead, it raced back to that very morning, a world away now, when life felt almost ordinary. She remembered waking in her family's sprawling, drafty manor. The great windows had been pale with mist, the scent of old books and beeswax polish lingering in the hallways. In the kitchen, Mrs. Browning, their housekeeper for decades, fussed over breakfast, as if Victoria were still a child. "Out riding again, Lady Beaumont?" she'd asked, lips pursed, but her eyes soft with worry. Victoria had only smiled and poured herself a cup of Earl Grey, savoring the warmth, the familiarity, the sense that, despite everything, she was home. Later, she'd pulled on her wax jacket, boots still muddy from yesterday, and found Willow waiting by the stable, ears pricked, breath steaming in the crisp air. To anyone else, it might have looked like some idyllic country routine. But beneath the surface, tension was brewing. For weeks, Victoria had felt the pressure mounting. Rumors about Lord Hargrove's plans ran wild through the village. First whispered at the post office, then shouted at the pub as pints were drained and tempers frayed. The National Trust had asked her to keep a low profile, but she couldn't sit by while someone tried to gut the very soul of Exmoor. So she doubled her patrols, met with old shepherds and young activists, mapped out threatened footpaths, and documented rare species Hargrove surveyors seemed eager to overlook. None of it had prepared her for this. The realization stung. She'd been followed, watched, ambushed. She replayed every detail. Willow's nervous glance at the trees, the too quiet hush that settled just before the attack, the way one man's accent had slipped from polished to rough as soon as he thought she couldn't fight back. Victoria wanted to scream at herself for not noticing sooner, but regret would not loosen the ropes or warm her frozen skin. Lightning flashed far off on the horizon, briefly illuminating the moor. Rain poured in earnest now, seeping through her clothes, soaking her to the skin. Victoria shuddered and bit her lip to keep from crying out. She had survived fox hunts gone wrong, storms that left entire herds stranded, and debates that would make lesser men break. But this was different. Here, the enemy wasn't nature, but greed, arrogance, and the kind of entitlement that could turn neighbors into accomplices. As midnight crept closer, Victoria tried to focus on anything but the pain. Her thoughts turned to her family. Her brother, Henry, away in London, always promising to visit but never finding time. Her mother, proud and sharp-tongued, who insisted that the Beaumont name meant something, even if the rest of England had forgotten. What would they do if she never came home? Would anyone come looking? Or had Lord Hargrove's reach stretched further than she dared imagine? Suddenly, footsteps crunched on the wet ground. Victoria's heart lurched. Hope, fear, anger, all tangled together. She strained to see through the darkness. A flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the rain, revealing two figures moving between the trees. For a split second, she almost cried out, but then she recognized the shapes. Not rescuers, but the same men who'd tied her here, back to check on their handiwork.
They spoke in low voices, one cursing about the weather, the other grumbling about that bloody woman. Victoria pressed herself against the tree, breath held tight, praying they would leave her alone. As they drew closer, she caught the glint of a phone screen, one of them snapping a photo of her bound and shivering. Insurance, she realized, against any future claims she might make. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold. "Don't worry, lady," the taller man sneered. "Hargrove will have this place cleared out before you can blink. Nobody's going to miss a spoiled little aristocrat meddling in things she doesn't understand." They laughed, boots squelching in the mud as they walked away. Victoria waited until their voices faded before she let herself breathe again. Rage simmered in her chest, but it was quickly drowned out by despair. She tested the ropes once more, gritting her teeth, but they held fast. The hours dragged by, each one colder and wetter than the last. At some point, exhaustion claimed her. Her head lolled against the tree, and in the darkness, her mind conjured strange dreams. Memories of family picnics on the moor, Willow running free across the hills, her mother reading poetry by the fire, her father's laughter echoing through the halls of Beaumont Manor. She clung to those fragments, using them as a shield against the growing fear that she might never see morning. But hope is a stubborn thing. Somewhere deep inside, Victoria refused to let go. She recalled stories of her ancestors, women and men who'd survived wars, bankruptcies, betrayals, and worse. If they could endure, so could she. All she had to do was make it through the night. By the time the sky began to lighten, Victoria's body was numb, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. The wind had died down, but the cold remained, sharp as a knife. She heard birds waking, the distant sound of hooves. Her heart leapt, but it was only a wild pony, sniffing the air, curiosity gleaming in its eyes. It wandered close, then farther away, disappearing into the fog. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not from pain, but from the sheer injustice of it all. She was a protector of this land, a voice for the voiceless, and yet here she was, silenced, abandoned, left to the mercy of men who valued money over memory. Still, as the sun's first rays broke through the clouds, casting pale gold across the moor, Victoria lifted her head, set her jaw, and whispered into the wind, "I will not give up." Because someone, somewhere, had to stand for what was right, and as long as she breathed, she would not let the darkness win. Dawn crept over Exmoor in slow, uncertain shades of gray. The world seemed to hold its breath, the moorland shrouded in mist, as if mourning with Victoria Beaumont. Every muscle in her body throbbed with exhaustion, but the night had done something to her spirit, a quiet hardening, a stubborn refusal to give in to despair. She opened her eyes, blinking away tears and the memory of dreams that had flickered in the darkness, half-remembered scraps of warmth and laughter from a life that felt impossibly far away. Her wrists ached where the ropes bit in, and her skin was numb beneath sodden clothes, but she forced herself to look up, to study the world around her with the clear-headed pragmatism her mother had always admired. The rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle, soaking the earth and turning the air heavy with the scent of peat and bracken. Somewhere nearby, a skylark called, a fragile, trembling sound that made her chest ache with longing for freedom. Victoria tried again to shift her weight, pressing her shoulder against the tree, but the knots wouldn't budge. She let her head fall back, watching the way the fog drifted through the oaks, pooling in the hollows. For a moment, she let herself think about her mother in the manor house, pacing in the drawing room, worry twisting her features. Would she send for help, or would she trust in her daughter's unbreakable will, believing that Victoria was simply out on another long patrol? Her thoughts wandered to her brother Henry, so rarely home, too busy with London life to understand the slow magic of Exmoor. What would he say if he could see her now, tied to an ancient oak, a symbol of all that was wrong with the world and all that needed defending? She wondered, not for the first time, if her family's legacy was a blessing or a curse. The ache in her arms sharpened with every passing minute. She shivered, teeth clattering, but she refused to let fear consume her. Instead, she searched her memory for moments of strength. Her first fox hunt as a child, the day she'd stood up to Lord Hargrove in the council chambers, the countless afternoons spent riding Willow through wind and rain, determined to keep Exmoor wild and free. A sudden movement caught her eye. Something was there in the mist, not a person. She strained, hope flickering, but the sound was softer, less threatening. Through the gloom, a shape materialized, a pony, small and sturdy, its coat the color of storm clouds. Victoria stared in disbelief. It was an Exmoor pony, one of the wild herd that roamed these lands for generations. Its eyes, wide and dark, met hers with an intelligence that made her breath catch. The pony stepped closer, nostrils flaring, curiosity overcoming caution. Victoria tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Hey there, aren't you a brave one?" The pony snorted and pawed the ground. Behind it, another appeared, then a third, until half a dozen ponies stood in a loose half-circle around her. She recognized their leader immediately, a stallion with a glossy black coat and a jagged scar along his flank. Blackthorn. He was a legend among the local shepherds, a creature as much a part of Exmoor as the heather and the rain. He stared at Victoria, head high, tail flicking, as if appraising her worth. She laughed softly, a sound brittle with relief and surprise. "Come to see the spectacle, have you? Or are you here to keep an eye on me?" The ponies shifted, and Blackthorn stepped forward. The others followed, forming a protective ring around the tree. Victoria watched, transfixed, as they began to paw at the earth, sniffing the air, searching for water or food beneath the roots. One of the younger ponies brushed against her legs, its warm breath a comfort in the chilly morning. The herd's presence drove away some of the loneliness that had threatened to crush her spirit in the night. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of wet fur and wild grass. For the first time since the attack, she felt less like a victim and more like a part of the land itself, interwoven with its rhythms and struggles, its moments of mercy. The pony's gentle movements calmed her, the steady sound of hooves and soft snorts grounding her in the present. She began to imagine a way out,
her mind tracing the old tracks that wound through the woods, the hidden dips and rises only someone born to Exmoor would know. If she could survive until nightfall, perhaps someone would come searching, a rambler, a farmer, maybe even a fellow National Trust patrol. She focused on the ropes, twisting her wrists subtly, feeling the fibers loosen slightly as the rain continued to soak them. It wasn't much, but it was something. She kept her movements slow, careful not to startle the ponies or attract the attention of her captors if they lingered nearby. Hours passed. The sun struggled to pierce the cloud cover, but the world grew lighter, the colors of the moor returning in muted greens and browns. Victoria drifted in and out of wakefulness, her mind flitting between memories and plans, clinging to the presence of the ponies for comfort. At one point, Blackthorn nudged her shoulder with his nose, the warmth startling her awake. She managed a smile, weak but genuine. "You're a good lad, aren't you? Not much for conversation, but better company than most men I know." The ponies eventually settled around her, some lying down, their bodies shielding her from the wind. She marveled at their trust, the wildness in their eyes tempered by a strange ancient kinship. It struck her, as she sat trapped and shivering, that the very creatures Hargrove wanted to drive out were the ones keeping her alive. She let herself drift, comforted by the rise and fall of their breathing, the knowledge that she wasn't truly alone. Somewhere out there, Willow might still be roaming free. Somewhere out there, people would start to worry. But for now, she belonged to Exmoor, to the wind and rain, to the herd of ponies standing sentinel through her darkest hour. And in that moment, a fragile thread of hope wound itself through her heart. A hope that maybe, just maybe, she would survive this trial, and that justice could still find a foothold in the wild heart of England. The day wore on in a haze of pain and exhaustion, but something had shifted for Victoria. The wild Exmoor ponies, their presence steady and unhurried, became a living barrier against the chill and fear that gnawed at her resolve. Blackthorn stood nearest, that old battle-scar glinting against his dark coat as he watched the horizon, every inch a guardian. The other ponies, younger and smaller, milled around the base of the tree, occasionally lowering their heads to graze or shake out their tangled manes. It was the most extraordinary company, untamed, yet comforting, a reminder that Exmoor itself had not abandoned her.
By midday, the mist had lifted just enough for Victoria to glimpse the far edges of the moor. The wind still carried a threat of rain, but the herd's bodies offered warmth, and their quiet movements filled the silence. The ropes binding her wrists had become a little looser, the fibers swollen with water. Each small shift, each flex of her aching fingers felt like a silent rebellion against her captors and the injustice that brought her here. She began to study the ponies more closely, her mind seizing on small details to distract from pain. One filly bore a white streak on her forehead, her eyes bright with youth and curiosity. An older mare limped, favoring her left leg, but held herself with a dignity that made Victoria ache with recognition, strength in spite of hardship. There was a symmetry between her own struggles and those of the herd, both fighting to survive in a world that too often valued money over memory, progress over presence. As the ponies grazed, Blackthorn suddenly raised his head, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. He stepped toward a patch of soft earth and began to paw at the ground, scraping away mud and grass. The others gathered around, snuffling and nudging, until finally a shallow pool appeared, fed by a thin trickle of groundwater. One by one, the ponies drank, and then, almost impossibly, Blackthorn turned to Victoria and nudged her leg, as if inviting her to join them. She let out a shaky laugh, feeling almost foolish. "If only I could, friend. I'd trade anything for a cup of water right now." Her voice broke, rough with thirst and fatigue. Yet the absurdity of the moment, a young noblewoman tied to a tree and talking to wild ponies, filled her with a new sense of perspective. She wasn't invisible, wasn't forgotten. She was part of something older and wilder than the men who'd left her here. It was as if the land itself, through these animals, refused to let her go. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches, dappling her face with fleeting warmth. Victoria's mind wandered to the village council meetings, the endless debates and undercurrents of resentment that swirled around every decision. She thought of Dr. Oliver Thornton, her colleague at the National Trust, a man with a mind as sharp as a razor and a heart as soft as a peat bog after rain. He'd always warned her that Hargrove was more dangerous than he appeared, that power wielded in silence could be more destructive than any storm. She wished, not for the first time, that Oliver were here now, bringing his wry humor and steady hands to untangle the knots she could not. Suddenly, the herd tensed, ears swiveled, tails flicked. Blackthorn snorted and stomped a hoof, sending a warning shiver through the rest of the ponies. Victoria held her breath, fearing the return of her captors, but no human figures appeared. Instead, a pair of magpies burst from the undergrowth, their black and white wings flashing in the slanting light. The tension faded. The ponies resumed their grazing, but the moment left Victoria alert, every nerve sharpened by the knowledge that danger was never far away. As the afternoon wore on, the ponies began to settle, some lying down in the grass, forming a semicircle around Victoria. The effect was like a living wall, a ring of warmth and safety against the creeping cold. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, letting the steady sounds of their breathing lull her into a state that was neither sleep nor full consciousness. Her mind floated through memories, through lessons passed down by her mother and grandmother. She remembered stories of Exmoor's resilience, how the land had survived centuries of change, endured wars and floods and all manner of human schemes. It gave her strength. She would survive this too. She owed it not only to herself, but to all those who had come before her, who had fought in quieter ways to preserve the spirit of this place. The sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds with streaks of rose and gold. Victoria's hands throbbed, but she kept flexing her fingers, feeling for any give in the ropes. Her lips were cracked, her voice nearly gone. Yet hope, that fragile thread, grew stronger with each hour. She imagined the search parties that would form when she didn't return, the questions that would ripple through the village. She imagined Oliver refusing to be put off by official reassurances, demanding answers, following the faintest clue until he found her. It was almost dusk when a new sound drifted across the moor, the distant rhythmic beat of hooves, not the wild, unhurried trot of the Exmoor ponies, but something more purposeful. The herd tensed, Blackthorn snorted, and the others gathered around Victoria, pressing closer. For a heart-stopping moment, she wondered if her captors had returned, ready to finish what they started.
But no voices cut the air. The sound faded, and after a few minutes, Victoria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Blackthorn nudged her once more, and she managed a weak smile. "You're braver than I am tonight. Maybe you're waiting for someone too." Night settled, soft and deep. The ponies stood guard, their bodies a bulwark against the chill. And Victoria, her hope renewed by the simple, unspoken kindness of the wild, resolved to hold on, because somewhere out there, help had to be coming. All she had to do was last until morning. Evening fell heavy on the moor, painting the sky in fading purples and bruised blue as the last of the light slipped behind the hills. The wind, never fully gone, returned in restless gusts, rattling the branches above Victoria Beaumont's head. She could barely feel her hands now, the rope soggy and digging into her wrists. But the herd of Exmoor ponies clustered closer as the night deepened, their bodies radiating warmth, their steady presence more reassuring than any blanket. She dozed in and out, each time waking with a start, uncertain if hours or minutes had passed. Sometimes she dreamed of her childhood, of running wild with Willow along these very ridges, and sometimes she dreamed of Hargrove's cold eyes and the laughter of the men who'd left her here.
Each time she awoke, she found Blackthorn standing sentinel, his breath steaming in the chill, his gaze unwavering. Even as exhaustion dragged at her, some stubborn flicker of hope inside her refused to go out. Then, deep into the night, something changed. A sharp crack split the silence, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking underfoot. Instantly the ponies stirred, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Blackthorn stamped the ground, his body rigid with alarm. Victoria's heart lurched. Was it them? Back again to make sure she hadn't escaped? She pressed herself against the tree as best she could, trying to make herself small, invisible. The sound grew louder, footsteps, careful, searching, human. Then a flashlight beam danced across the trees, its white circle wobbling through the shadows. Victoria's throat closed with mingled relief and new fear. If it was Hargrove's men, she might not survive the night. But the beam stopped just shy of her, the footsteps pausing. "Hello?" a voice called, low but clear, tense with worry. "Is anyone out here?" She recognized that voice, even through the fog of exhaustion. Dr. Oliver Thornton, her colleague, her friend, the only person she trusted to follow the trail when others doubted. Her breath caught, a sob escaping before she could help it. "Oliver, here, over here!" The flashlight swung toward her, and in seconds he was running, mud splashing, his boots finding purchase in the long grass. He dropped to his knees beside her, breathless, his face pinched with concern. "Victoria, thank God! I've been searching half the night. Are you hurt?" She could barely form the words. "Just cold, tied up. They took Willow." His hands were already at the knots, working them loose with quick, practiced fingers. "Hold on, you're safe now," he murmured, voice steady even as his hands shook. "You're safe. I'm here." The ropes fell away, and the ache in her arms returned full force, as blood rushed back to her hands. She winced but managed a grateful smile. "Told you Exmoor was full of surprises." Oliver offered his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders, then helped her to her feet. She swayed, the world tilting, but he caught her, steadying her with a strong arm. "Easy, I've got you. Can you walk?" She nodded, her legs trembling beneath her. "I'll manage. We can't stay here. Someone might come back. Hargrove's men." "I know," he said, his voice grim. "I found Willow tied to a fence half a mile from here, frightened but unharmed. That's when I saw the pony tracks. I thought maybe you'd taken shelter somewhere, but the marks circled back here." He looked over his shoulder, eyes widening, as he took in the herd still gathered protectively around them. "They really stayed with you, didn't they?" Victoria nodded, tears stinging her eyes as she watched Blackthorn nudge closer, his gaze full of ancient wisdom. "They saved me, Oliver. If it weren't for them, I might not have survived the night." He squeezed her hand. "Let's get you out of here." Together, they made their way through the dark, Oliver guiding her with gentle encouragement, his flashlight illuminating the rough path. The ponies followed, silent sentinels in the night, and Victoria drew strength from their presence with every unsteady step. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, Willow was waiting, eyes wide but calm, as if she'd been standing guard for hours. Oliver lifted Victoria onto her mare's back, steadying her, then walked beside them as they set off for the nearest farmhouse. They traveled in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustling grass and the ponies' hooves on damp earth. When at last the farmhouse lights appeared in the distance, Victoria let out a shaky breath. She was safe, but her anger burned hotter than ever. Hargrove had gone too far this time. Inside the farmhouse, Mrs. Hargreaves, the farmer's wife, fussed over Victoria with blankets and hot tea, her face pale with shock as she listened to the story. Oliver called the authorities, demanding they send officers and medics. The farmer himself slipped out to check on the ponies, bringing them a bucket of oats, murmuring in awe at Blackthorn and his herd. "Never seen them stick so close to a person before," he whispered. "It's like they knew you needed them." By the time the police arrived, Victoria had warmed enough to speak clearly. She recounted every detail: the ambush, the threats, the cruelty of being left helpless in the wild. Oliver filled in the rest, telling the officers about the pony tracks and the evidence of Willow's abandonment. The officers listened closely, their faces growing dark with anger as they realized the full scope of Hargrove's scheme. But even as exhaustion threatened to pull Victoria under, she couldn't rest. She knew what would come next. Hargrove, with his money and influence, would deny everything. He'd call her story an invention, a melodrama spun by a woman too attached to old ways. But she had the truth, and she had allies. She looked at Oliver, saw the determination in his eyes, and knew she wouldn't be fighting alone. She leaned back in her chair, tea warming her hands, and watched through the window as Blackthorn led his herd away, disappearing into the morning mist. They had saved her, and in their wild, unspoken way, reminded her what she was fighting for: justice, land, and the right for wild things and wild people to survive. The days after her rescue blurred together, a whirl of statements, interviews, and restless nights as Victoria recovered in the safety of the farmhouse. News of the attack spread quickly across the village, igniting the small community like dry gorse touched by flame. Sympathy poured in, but so did doubt, suspicion, and the heavy hand of politics. Lady Victoria Beaumont, the headline read in the local papers, noblewoman assaulted in Exmoor woods. There were as many whispers as there were facts, and in every pub and post office, opinions clashed as fiercely as the Exmoor wind. Despite her exhaustion, Victoria insisted on giving a detailed account to the police, not just once, but several times, refusing to let the story twist out of shape. Oliver stood by her through every interview, offering measured words and quiet support. But even as the investigation began, it was clear that Lord Reginald Hargrove's influence reached further than anyone wanted to admit. Officers in crisp uniforms listened carefully but with guarded faces. Some nodded with concern, others frowned as if weighing each word for exaggeration. By the third day, Victoria's strength had returned. The bruises on her wrists were turning yellow, her voice was firm again, and the fire in her eyes had only grown brighter. She rode Willow back to the village, Oliver at her side, determined not to hide. The sight of her, alive, unbroken, caused a ripple of quiet pride among those who lined the lanes to watch her pass. Some waved, some simply tipped their hats, but all recognized the meaning. She would not be silenced. Still, the real battle had only just begun. The Exmoor Parish Council, a gathering of landowners and local officials, called a special meeting to discuss recent events and allegations. Victoria was summoned to attend, her presence requested as both a witness and a party to the controversy. The council's meetings were rarely more than formalities, a place to debate fence repairs and sheep crossings, but tonight every seat was filled, the room thick with tension. Lord Hargrove was there, of course, impeccably dressed and unshakably calm, flanked by his usual circle of associates, businessmen, lawyers, men who'd never set foot on the moor without checking their shoes for mud. He rose as Victoria entered, offering a bow that was just polite enough to sting. "Lady Beaumont, I trust you're feeling better," he said, his voice carrying a smooth note of concern. Victoria met his gaze head-on, refusing to flinch. "I am, thank you. I only regret that such a meeting is necessary." Hargrove spread his hands, palms open. "We're all here to find the truth. Accusations have been made, very serious ones. I hope you have evidence to support your claims."
There was a murmur among the councillors. Some looked at Victoria with sympathy, others with open skepticism. She took a breath and began to speak, telling her story once more. How she'd been ambushed, tied, left to the elements. How the ponies had gathered around her, and how Oliver had followed their tracks to find her alive. She presented the photos Oliver had taken of the ropes, the hoofprints, Willow's condition. But as she spoke, she could feel the doubt coiling in the room, fed by Hargrove's subtle smirks and whispered asides. When she finished, Hargrove stood. "I'm afraid this is all very theatrical, but is it truly plausible that a group of respectable men, many of whom are in this room, would resort to such primitive tactics? Surely, Lady Beaumont, you must see how this strains belief." A few voices echoed his sentiment. Victoria's heart pounded, anger building. But before she could answer, Oliver rose. "With respect, Lord Hargrove, if you find Lady Beaumont's story so implausible, perhaps you can explain why her horse was found abandoned, why she was found tied to a tree in the state she was in, and why the herd of wild ponies led me directly to her. Unless you wish us to believe she orchestrated the entire ordeal herself." A quiet fell over the room. For a moment, Hargrove's mask slipped. Then he smiled, that practiced politician's smile, and shrugged. "I make no accusations. I only want what's best for Exmoor. Surely we can all agree that wild claims and hysteria help no one." Victoria felt her temper snap. What's best for Exmoor is to preserve its heritage, not sell it off for profit under the guise of progress. This land isn't yours to ruin. You can try to smear my name, but you can't erase the truth. People know what happened. The land knows. And the ponies? Well, they know better than all of us. That last line drew a few startled chuckles from the audience, but more importantly, it brought murmurs of support. Someone in the back stood and spoke. "She's right. We've seen what happens when outsiders meddle. I stand with Lady Beaumont." Another voice joined, then another, until half the room had spoken, voices overlapping in a groundswell of support. Lord Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "This isn't a popularity contest," he said, but the momentum had shifted. The council called for an inquiry, and for the first time in living memory, the meeting ended with more questions than answers. Outside, the night air felt electrified. A crowd had gathered, candles flickering in the dusk, handmade signs declaring "Save Exmoor" and "Stand with Victoria." Someone handed her a bouquet of heather. Oliver squeezed her shoulder. "You started something, Vic. I don't think Hargrove expected a fight like this." She looked out at the faces, old friends, farmers, children, and felt pride swell in her chest. "This isn't just about me," she said quietly. "It never was. Exmoor belongs to everyone willing to defend it." As the crowd began to sing an old folk tune, their voices rising and falling with the wind, Victoria knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time, she truly believed they could win, not just for her, but for the wild, stubborn heart of Exmoor itself. Rumors have a way of growing roots in Exmoor's wet earth, twisting through every hedge and lane until no one is quite sure where they began. In the weeks that followed the council meeting, Victoria felt them everywhere. In the way strangers watched her at the market, in the nervous glances exchanged in the pub, in the sudden hush that fell when she entered the post office. Some said she was a heroine, a living legend. Others whispered about hysteria and pride, about noblewomen who'd lost touch with reality. But Victoria didn't care. She rode Willow through the lanes with her head high, knowing her courage wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the community that was slowly, quietly standing behind her. Oliver Thornton had become her shadow, both friend and ally, helping her gather evidence and record the damage to the land. Together they walked the moors with field notebooks, snapping photos of trampled fences, disturbed habitats, and muddy tire tracks where there should have been nothing but wildflowers. Oliver had a gift for making people talk. He coaxed stories from shepherds and schoolchildren, piecing together a mosaic of small wrongs that, taken together, became a tapestry of exploitation. But the pressure was mounting. Lord Hargrove was not a man to retreat. His lawyers filed claims of defamation, demanding public apologies and threatening lawsuits. His associates worked the village, offering generous partnership opportunities to anyone willing to distance themselves from Victoria and Oliver. Late-night calls rattled her phone, full of veiled threats and sly promises, calls she never answered, but which made her double-check every lock and glance over her shoulder on every ride. One evening, as a squall rolled in from the sea and lashed rain against the manor's ancient stones, Victoria sat by the fire, sorting through piles of correspondence. Her mother, sharp-eyed as ever, watched her over a pair of half-moon spectacles. "You look tired, darling," she said, her voice gentle for once. Victoria nodded. "It's not just the council anymore. Hargrove's men are sabotaging fences. I found one of the foals limping this morning. Someone had scattered glass along the grazing trails. And the emails, the letters, sometimes I feel like it'll never end." Her mother set her tea down. "You know the price of making enemies, Victoria, but you also know how to fight with your head, not just your heart. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you lose your temper in public. Keep records, build your case, and don't be afraid to ask for help." Victoria managed a weary smile. "You sound like grandmother." That's because she was right. Oliver arrived later, dripping wet, clutching a battered satchel. "I found something," he said without preamble, shaking water from his coat. He spread out a collection of documents on the kitchen table. Leases, contracts, letters bearing Hargrove's elegant signature. "One of the farmhands found these stuffed behind an old feed bin. I think they were meant to burn." Victoria read, the words leaping off the page. There were detailed lists of payments, thinly veiled bribes to councillors and local business owners, promises of favorable contracts if they voted in favor of Hargrove's development plan. There were even emails discussing the best way to manage opposition, her name circled, underlined, with notes about removing the Beaumont problem. Her stomach twisted, but adrenaline surged through her veins. "This is what we needed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We bring this to the authorities, to the press. He can't buy his way out of this, not if the village stands together." Oliver nodded. "I've already made copies. And Victoria, someone in the council tipped me off. We're not alone. People are waking up." They spent the next day compiling everything into a comprehensive report. When they walked into the local police station, thick binders in hand, the officer on duty listened carefully, eyes widening as he read the evidence. "These are serious allegations, Lady Beaumont," he said. "We'll open a formal investigation at once. And, off the record, I've seen too many odd things these last few months to doubt your story." Word spread quickly. By evening, journalists from Exeter and London were arriving, cameras and microphones in tow. Victoria gave her statement on the village green, the wind whipping her hair around her face as she spoke about stewardship, justice, and the wild things that could not defend themselves. She named Hargrove's crimes, reading from the documents, refusing to be silenced. Oliver stood beside her, silent but unshakable. The backlash was immediate. That night, someone smashed the windows of the National Trust office. A protest broke out near Hargrove's estate, villagers waving homemade signs and chanting, "Exmoor for the people." But the real battle was in the council chamber, where a vote of no confidence was called for Hargrove and his cronies. Some members resigned on the spot. Others, desperate to save their reputations, turned against Hargrove with the wind. Victoria didn't celebrate. She knew this was only the beginning. Hargrove had money, power, and friends in high places. The lawsuits wouldn't go away overnight. But the tide had turned. When she walked the moors now, children ran to greet her, farmers lifted their hats, and the herd of ponies grazed near her, unafraid. Blackthorn, the old stallion, often appeared at dawn outside the manor, as if reminding her that wildness can't be bought or bullied into submission. Late one night, as she rode Willow beneath the stars, Victoria let herself hope for the first time in weeks. The land felt alive beneath her, humming with a strength as old as England itself. And she whispered to the wind, "I'm not finished, not yet. They'll never take Exmoor from us, not as long as we remember what's worth fighting for." Morning broke with a pale, silvery sun, as Exmoor seemed to exhale after weeks of storm and tension.
Victoria woke early, restless with anticipation, and walked the estate's dew-soaked lawns in her boots, breathing in the scent of new grass and wood smoke drifting from the village chimneys. She could feel the land shifting beneath her. Something had changed. For the first time in months, the weight of fear was less heavy, replaced by a cautious optimism threading its way through the community.
In the days that followed the vote of no confidence and the police investigation, the energy in the village was electric. Neighbors who had hardly spoken for years found themselves talking across hedgerows, trading news and stories, emboldened by a shared sense of purpose. Mrs. Hargreaves, the farmer's wife who had cared for Victoria after her ordeal, started a petition calling for the permanent protection of Exmoor's wild herds and ancient trails. Children painted signs with bright colors: "Save our ponies," "Exmoor belongs to us," "Justice for Lady Beaumont." Oliver and Victoria threw themselves into the new campaign with a vigor fueled by vindication. The evidence they'd uncovered was now public: letters and contracts published in local newspapers, a feature on the BBC, even a brief interview with Victoria herself, standing beside Willow and Blackthorn for the cameras. Her voice, once trembling from fatigue, was now calm and resolute as she spoke about community, stewardship, and the power of standing up together. And for a while, it seemed the tide had turned for good. The council, under new leadership, established Midnight Ridge Nature Reserve on a stretch of the most threatened land, a haven not only for Exmoor ponies, but for rare birds, wildflowers, and the generations of people who walked those footpaths. Victoria helped organize open days, inviting schoolchildren and retired soldiers from a nearby veterans' home to learn about the land's history and the delicate balance that made it unique. There was laughter and learning, muddy boots and shared flasks of tea, the simple pleasures that reminded everyone why Exmoor mattered. But even as hope blossomed, Lord Hargrove was not finished. He retreated from the public eye, his estate gates locked tight, but his lawyers were relentless. Lawsuits arrived almost weekly, claims of slander, obstruction, loss of business opportunities. Anonymous leaflets appeared in mailboxes, accusing Victoria and her supporters of anti-progress hysteria. One night, a shed at the reserve was set alight. The flames were put out quickly, but the message was clear: the battle wasn't over. The community rallied, angry and afraid in equal measure. Victoria found herself at the center of it all, fielding phone calls at all hours, attending emergency meetings, and reassuring nervous neighbors that they wouldn't be bullied into silence. The weight was immense, sometimes crushing. She leaned on Oliver more than ever, finding comfort in his steady presence and sharp mind. He reminded her to rest, to let others take the lead when she was worn thin. "You're not alone in this," he would say, touching her shoulder lightly. "Exmoor belongs to everyone willing to fight for it." One morning, as Victoria was mending a broken fence along the edge of the new reserve, she heard the unmistakable sound of children laughing. Turning, she saw a group from the village school, boots caked with mud, faces bright with excitement as their teacher led them up the trail. They stopped when they spotted her, eyes wide. "Are you really Lady Beaumont?" a little girl asked. Victoria smiled, kneeling down in the grass. "Yes, I am. And you are standing on one of the oldest footpaths in Exmoor. Did you know ponies have walked this way for hundreds of years?" The children crowded closer as she told them about Blackthorn and his herd, about the night the wild ponies had kept her safe, about the importance of caring for the land. When Blackthorn himself appeared on the rise, regal and unafraid, the children gasped in wonder, reaching out with small, gentle hands as he watched them with calm, dark eyes. Moments like these buoyed Victoria through the hardest days, but even so, the strain was never far. Each legal summons, each threat or rumor, took a little more out of her. At times, she wondered if it would ever truly end, or if Hargrove's reach would always cast a shadow over her home. The final confrontation came in the county court, a grand, drafty building in the city, where journalists crowded the steps and villagers packed the gallery. Victoria sat at the front, Oliver by her side, her mother and Henry in the row behind. Hargrove arrived flanked by his lawyers, his face set in stone, refusing to meet Victoria's eyes. The judge, stern and impatient, listened as the lawyers argued about rights and responsibilities, about public good and private property, about tradition and progress. Victoria's voice was steady when she spoke. She described the land, its history, and its meaning, not just to her family, but to everyone who called Exmoor home. She described the ponies, the people, the stormy night when the wild and the human came together to survive. She answered every question, every insinuation, with honesty and grace. When it was over, she sat back, exhausted, waiting for the verdict.
The court ruled in favor of the community. The new nature reserve would remain, the land protected. Hargrove's plans were struck down, his lawsuits dismissed. He stormed out of the courtroom, his power finally broken, not by money or influence, but by the voices of ordinary people who refused to be silenced. That night, the village gathered on Midnight Ridge under a sky heavy with stars. A bonfire blazed, children sang, and Blackthorn's herd watched from the shadows. Victoria stood beside Oliver, her heart full and her voice strong as she spoke, not just for herself, but for every wild and stubborn soul who had ever called Exmoor home. For once there was peace, and the knowledge that they had saved something precious, together. The days that followed the court victory were softer, quieter, as if the land itself breathed a little easier. Exmoor stretched beneath the spring sun, its colors deepening, a patchwork of emerald fields, wild gorse, and the gray-green moor rolling into the distance. For the first time in months, Victoria felt the relentless knot of anxiety loosen in her chest. She allowed herself to wake slowly, to linger over her tea, to walk with Willow at dawn along the dew-laden hedgerows, the world shining with possibility. It would be easy, perhaps, for the story to end there, with banners waving and bonfires burning and Lord Hargrove's influence finally vanquished. But Victoria knew that real change was quieter, slower, and much more complicated. The scars from the fight lingered in the village. Some old friendships were still tender from the strain. New debates cropped up as the community debated the reserve's rules, argued about tourism, and wrestled with how to balance preservation with progress. She felt it on the morning she met with the other trustees of Midnight Ridge Reserve. They gathered in a circle of folding chairs beneath an ancient oak, a mix of farmers, teachers, and retired soldiers, each bringing their own stories and hopes. The air was brisk, alive with the smell of damp earth and wild thyme. Victoria spoke about maintaining footpaths, about educating schoolchildren, about holding guided walks for veterans who found peace on the quiet hills. An old shepherd, his face weathered as the moor, tapped his cane against the ground. "It's a fine thing you did, Lady Beaumont, but it won't last if we forget what it cost us. You stood up when the rest of us were afraid." Victoria shook her head. "I only stood because you all held me up. No one does this alone. The land needs caretakers. Many, not one. That's how we keep Exmoor safe. Together." They talked and argued and laughed, and by the meeting's end, Victoria felt lighter, knowing the work ahead would be shared. She walked home through the fields, the late sun gilding the grass, and found herself thinking about all that had happened. The bitter winter night, the wild ponies, the courtroom drama, the outpouring of support. Each piece part of something larger, a living tapestry of struggle and hope. Yet as the excitement faded, a new lesson emerged. She realized it in moments of solitude, standing on the ridge with Blackthorn's herd grazing nearby, watching the foals kick up their heels in the low sunlight. Life in Exmoor had always been about endurance, not just survival, but adaptation. The land had endured centuries of change, just as its people had learned to weather storms both literal and political. The ponies had taught her that lesson in the simplest way. by coming to her when she was helpless, offering warmth and presence without expectation. They hadn't rescued her out of charity. It was instinct, a reminder that connection between wild and human, old and new, was the source of resilience. She saw it in the way the herd moved as one, protecting the weak, sharing what little they found, each member essential to the whole. It was a lesson the community, fractured at times, but unbroken, needed to remember. One evening, Oliver joined Victoria on a slow ride across the high ground. The wind danced around them, ruffling Willow's mane and carrying the distant call of curlews. We stopped to watch Blackthorn and his herd, the old stallion as regal as ever, standing guard as the ponies grazed. Oliver dismounted, standing beside Victoria in the fading light. It's strange, isn't it, how easily we forget the things that keep us alive. Not just the land, but each other. Victoria nodded, her gaze on the ponies. We're all tied to this place. We survive because we belong, to the earth, to our history, to each other. I learned that the hard way. I thought I had to fight alone, but it was the ponies that saved me, and then the village. Even Hargrove, in his own way, he reminded us what matters. Oliver looked at her, eyes gentle. You changed more than you realize, Vic. You reminded people what Exmoor means. And you showed them that even when the powerful try to take everything, ordinary people can say no.
Victoria smiled, but it was a quiet, reflective smile. I hope we remember. I hope we teach the next generation that it's not just about fighting. It's about listening, about being present. The ponies survive because they listen to the land, trust each other, move as one. Maybe we should too. For a long while, they stood in companionable silence, watching the sky burn orange and gold, feeling the land settle beneath them. Later, Victoria walked home alone, the cool air sharp with the scent of moss and water. She passed the village green where children played, their laughter bright and unburdened. She saw neighbors talking, planning the next community project, their voices full of new energy. And she felt in her bones a kind of peace she hadn't known before. Not the peace of victory, but of purpose, of belonging. That night she wrote in her journal by candlelight, her words shaped by all she'd learned. We endure not just by holding on, but by reaching out. The land, the ponies, the people, they're all bound by something deeper than ownership. Exmoor's strength is in its community, in its stubborn, gentle refusal to be tamed. The wild things save us, remind us who we are, and teach us to protect what matters, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after. That's the real legacy. She closed the book, listening to the wind rattle the old windows. Outside, the night was alive with the quiet music of Exmoor. Ponies shifting in the grass, an owl calling, the heart of the land beating on. Victoria smiled, knowing her story wasn't just her own. It was everyone's, and it would endure. Spring faded gently into summer, and the wildflowers returned to Exmoor in dazzling, unexpected bursts of color. Victoria often found herself waking before dawn, the birds singing at her window, the air full of the promise of a new season. There was still so much work to do, petitions to sign, paths to repair, meetings to lead. But each morning felt lighter now, anchored in the knowledge that they had, for once, turned the tide. She had become something of a local legend, though the title sat awkwardly on her shoulders. Children stopped her in the lanes to ask about Blackthorn and the herd. Strangers sent letters of thanks and stories of their own battles to save wild places. Older villagers who once scoffed at the idea of a lady on a crusade now nodded in approval, some even asking for advice about their own bits of land. The Midnight Ridge Reserve thrived.
The wild ponies roamed freely through new meadows, sharing space with rare butterflies, foxes, and, on more than one occasion, a cluster of city children on a school outing. Victoria made a point to greet every group, to kneel in the grass and tell the story of the stormy night, of the wild herd's instinct to gather and protect, and how sometimes the best guardians of the land are those who have no voice but their presence. She saw wonder in the children's eyes, and sometimes in their teachers', and she felt something in her heart settle. Maybe, just maybe, this was how real change took root, not in courtrooms, but in moments of awe and connection. Oliver, ever the realist, reminded her that victory never meant complacency. He walked the boundary lines with her, checking fences and water troughs, watching for new threats. Developers with more subtle tactics, government policy shifts, even well-meaning tourists who sometimes did more harm than good. But as they walked, he would squeeze her hand and say, "Still standin', Vic. Still here." The trust that formed among the villagers became the foundation of a new era. Old wounds from the fight against Hargrove slowly faded as people saw what was possible when they united, not just to resist, but to create. Farmers and hikers came together to restore ancient hedgerows. Retired soldiers volunteered to lead guided walks for veterans struggling with the invisible scars of war. Teachers started a nature club, and more than one shopkeeper set out a jar for donations to support the reserve. People argued, of course, they always would, but the arguments changed, shifting from fear and suspicion to practical questions about how best to keep Exmoor wild and welcoming. Even the annual festival changed. Instead of the usual contests and polite speeches, this year's gathering took place atop Midnight Ridge itself. A stage was set near the pony trails, and as dusk fell, villagers gathered under banners painted with handprints and hoofprints, testaments to the wild and human hands that had saved their home. There were songs and laughter, and when Victoria was called forward, she felt her voice tremble just a little with emotion.
She told them what she had learned, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. That justice required patience and persistence. That sometimes those on the margins, wild ponies, lonely children, skeptical elders, carried wisdom the rest ignored. She spoke of gratitude, for the land, for the community, for the herd that had kept her warm when all seemed lost. And she finished with a plea, not for applause, but for attention. Keep watch. Don't let what we've won be lost to indifference or the slow erosion of memory. Protect the land and each other. Our story is still being written, every day. As the sun slipped behind the hills, Blackthorn's herd emerged on the ridge. Their silhouettes cut against the sky, heads high, tails flicking in the golden light. The crowd fell silent, awed by the beauty and mystery of the moment. Victoria closed her eyes and listened to the low whicker of the ponies, the laughter of children, the gentle chorus of the Exmoor night. Later, as the festival waned and the villagers made their way home, Victoria stood with Oliver at the edge of the meadow. The firelight flickered across their faces, and for a long while they simply watched the stars. "Do you think it will last?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver squeezed her hand. "Nothing lasts forever, but what you did, what we did, will echo. You changed people, Vic. You gave them a reason to hope." Victoria nodded, her heart full. "It was never just me. It was all of us, even Blackthorn and Willow and everyone who stood up for what was right." Oliver smiled. "That's the lesson, isn't it? That the world changes not through grand gestures, but through the quiet courage of ordinary people, and the wild things that remind us of what's worth saving." As they walked home, lanterns bobbing in the distance, and the ridge alive with the music and laughter, Victoria felt the story settling inside her. Not an ending, but a beginning. A promise to keep the wild heart of Exmoor beating,
to carry the lessons of the struggle forward, and to remain always open to wonder. At her desk that night, she wrote a final letter to the community, to be read at the next council meeting and published in the village newsletter. Dear friends, let's never forget, the land endures when we endure together. Justice is not a moment, it's a practice, a promise we make to each other and the wild world around us. Take care of Exmoor, take care of each other. The ponies are still out there, and so is the future. Be watchful, be brave, and let your story add to ours. With hope, Victoria Beaumont. As she signed her name, she heard, faint and far away, the thunder of hooves across the midnight hills. She smiled, knowing that somewhere Blackthorn was running free, and that Exmoor would remain wild, beautiful, and alive, for all those willing to fight for it.